The look on his face when the pawnbroker said the words, "I'm sorry, son, but these aren't yours to sell," was something I have framed in my mind. It hangs in a gallery of moments I revisit whenever I need a reminder that the world, sometimes, does spin right. His jaw, usually set in a line of arrogant certainty, went slack. His eyes, which had held a glint of predatory triumph just moments before, darted around the dusty shop as if looking for an exit, an excuse, a different reality. He looked like a cartoon character who had just run off a cliff and hadn't yet realized he was treading on empty air. But the fall was coming. Oh, it was coming. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, standing there in the shadows at the back of the shop, hidden behind a tall rack of forgotten guitars, I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. Not yet. It was the grim, thin smile of a general watching a perfectly executed pincer movement finally close. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand the beauty of that collapse, you have to understand the decade of architecture that went into building the man who was about to be demolished. You have to understand the foundation of lies he was built upon. I'm sitting here now in my studio. The afternoon sun is streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the light in 1,000 tiny rainbows on the pieces I'm working on. It's a place of peace, a place I built with my own 2 hands, funded by the very legacy he tried to steal. On my workbench, resting on a velvet cloth, is my mother's locket. It's the one piece I kept for myself, the one piece that never went into the box. Touching its cool silver surface is what brings it all back. Let me start from the beginning. I met Richard in my last year of university. He was magnetic. He had a way of looking at you that made you feel like you were the only person in the universe. He was ambitious, studying to be a financial analyst, and he spoke of the future with such absolute certainty that it was impossible not to be swept up in his current. I was a quiet art student, more comfortable with a lump of clay or a soldering iron than with a room full of people. My passion was jewelry design, a love passed down from my mother. She had been my world, and after losing her to a sudden illness a year prior, I was adrift. Richard felt like an anchor. He saw my talent, or so he said. He called my designs brilliant, unique. He promised that one day he'd build an empire for us, and I'd be its celebrated artist with my own line, my own brand. It was a beautiful dream, and I, a grieving, lonely young woman, bought it wholesale. We married a year after graduation. His career took off like a rocket, just as he'd predicted. Mine, however, did not. "Just for a little while, darling," he'd say, kissing my forehead. "I need you to support me right now. We need a solid foundation. Once I make partner, you can do whatever you want." So I put my dreams on hold. I became the perfect corporate wife. I hosted the dinners. I remembered the birthdays of his clients. I laughed at the terrible jokes of his superiors. My workshop in the spare room gathered dust. My hands, once stained with polish and marked by fine tools, became soft and manicured. I was playing a part, and for a long time I convinced myself I was happy doing it. Then there was his mother, Eleanor. Eleanor viewed me not as a daughter-in-law, but as a competitor for her son's affection, and more importantly, his resources. She was a woman who measured worth in carats and square footage. My background, my quiet nature, my little hobby, as she called it, were all marks against me in her ledger. She would pick at me with 1,000 tiny cuts. "That dress is lovely, dear," she'd say. "Is it from a consignment shop? So clever of you to be frugal." "Richard tells me you used to make jewelry. What a sweet little pastime. I suppose it's good to have something to keep you busy." Each comment was designed to remind me of my place, a decorative but ultimately replaceable accessory to her son's brilliant life. Richard, of course, never saw it, or he chose not to. "That's just how she is, darling," he'd dismiss my concerns. "She means well." For 10 years, this was my life. I was the support beam, holding up the magnificent structure of Richard's career. I was the quiet, smiling wife, enduring the thinly veiled insults of his mother. I had sublimated my own identity so completely into his that I barely remembered the girl who once found joy in the curve of a silver wire. The only thing that was truly mine was my mother's jewelry box. It was a large rosewood chest filled with the pieces she had made over her lifetime. To Richard and Eleanor, they were just old-fashioned, slightly eccentric baubles. Eleanor once called them gaudy. Richard just saw them as sentimental clutter. But to me, they were everything. Each piece held a memory. A silver bracelet with tiny, intricate leaves she made for my 10th birthday. A sapphire ring, the color of her eyes, that she wore every single day. A heavy modernist necklace that I'd helped her design, my clumsy childhood sketches transformed by her genius into something beautiful. It was my connection to her, to the person I was and the artist I had once dreamed of becoming. I kept it safe. I kept it hidden. The inciting incident, the earthquake that brought the whole facade crashing down, came swiftly and without warning. Richard's firm was embroiled in a massive insider trading scandal. He wasn't one of the architects of the scheme, but he was caught in the blast radius. He was fired. Publicly. Humiliatingly. Overnight, the man who defined himself by his success was a failure. The income stopped. The prestige evaporated. The fair-weather friends disappeared. And the man I thought I knew vanished, replaced by a bitter, resentful stranger. His arrogance, once buoyed by success, curdled into a sneering cruelty. And it was all directed at me. Suddenly, my lack of a career wasn't a sacrifice I had made for us. It was a personal failing, a burden he had been forced to carry. The dinners I hosted weren't supportive. They were social climbing failures. My very presence in our large, now unaffordable house seemed to infuriate him. Eleanor, of course, fanned the flames. She moved into our guest room, ostensibly to support her poor boy, but really to form a united front against me. They would sit in the living room for hours drinking expensive wine we could no longer afford, their voices low and venomous. I became the scapegoat for everything, his failure, their precarious financial situation, the shame. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning. I came downstairs to find him and Eleanor at the dining room table, surrounded by overdue bills. Richard didn't look up. "We're going to lose the house," he said, his voice flat and dead. Eleanor shot me a look of pure loathing. "Unless we find a way to liquidate some assets," she added, her eyes flicking towards my left hand, where I wore my mother's sapphire ring. My blood ran cold. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it felt like a shout in the tense silence. Richard finally looked at me. His face was a mask of cold fury. "Don't be ridiculous," he snapped. "It's not a suggestion. I'm talking about that box of junk you keep in the closet, your mother's old things. We'll have them appraised. It could be enough to tide us over." Junk. He called her life's work. Junk. "No," I said again, louder this time. "Absolutely not. That is all I have left of her." He stood up then, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He was like a volcano about to explode. "You selfish woman!" he roared, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. "After everything I've given you, this house, this life, you've contributed nothing, and now, when I need you, you cling to some sentimental trash?" Eleanor chimed in, her voice like ice chips. "She's right, Richard. She never appreciated what you did for her. She was always holding back, always thinking of herself." I looked from his contorted face to her smug one, and in that moment, something inside me shifted. The love I had held for him, the loyalty I had shown, the excuses I had made for a decade, they all turned to ash. I wasn't looking at my husband anymore. I was looking at my enemy. And that's when the plan began to form. It wasn't a conscious thought at first, more of a cold, clear certainty that settled deep in my bones. I was not going to fight them. I was not going to argue or plead, because I knew a secret. A secret about my mother and her gaudy trinkets that they, in their greedy ignorance, could never comprehend. My mother, you see, was not just a hobbyist. In the years before she met my father, she had been a designer for some of the most exclusive, high-end jewelry houses in Europe. She worked under a pseudonym, a fiercely guarded secret. She was a prodigy, but she hated the commercialism, the egos, the endless pressure. So she walked away. She came home, met my father, and settled into a quiet life. But she never stopped creating. The pieces in that rosewood box were not just sentimental keepsakes. They were her private collection. They were experimental designs, prototypes for commissions she'd turned down, unique pieces made with rare stones and revolutionary techniques she had perfected. Each one bore her secret maker's mark, a tiny, almost invisible etching of a starling in flight. Their value wasn't just in the gold and the gems, which was substantial enough. Their true value was in their provenance, their artistry, their connection to a mysterious, legendary designer whose identity was one of the last great secrets of the jewelry world. And there was one other person on Earth who knew this secret, a man named Abe. Mr. Abe ran a dusty, unassuming pawn shop in a quieter part of the city. To the world, he was just a pawnbroker, but he was also one of the most respected gemologists and appraisers in the country. He and my mother had been friends for decades, kindred spirits who shared a love for the craft. He was the executor of her will, not just for her modest estate, but for her artistic legacy. The will was very specific. The collection was to remain mine, in trust, until my 40th birthday or a time of my choosing. It could not be sold or broken up without my express consent, verified in person, with him as the witness. It was a legal fortress my mother had built around her work and around me. Richard and Eleanor knew none of this. They just saw a box of old jewelry and a quick cash grab. Their greed was about to make them walk into a perfectly constructed legal cage, and I was going to hold the door open for them. So, I made the strategic decision. I would not fight. I would surrender. I would let him believe he had won. That night, after their tirade, I went to our bedroom. I took out a piece of paper and my hands started to shake. I began to document everything. I wrote down the conversation from that morning word for word. I started a log, backdating it as best I could, of every cruel remark from Richard, every snide comment from Eleanor, every threat, every demand. My grief and shock were hardening into something else. Resolve, cold, hard, and sharp as a diamond. The next morning, while they were out for a strategy lunch, I made the first call. "Abe's," a gruff voice answered. "Mr. Abe," I said, my own voice a whisper. "It's Clara, Amelia's daughter." There was a pause, and then the voice softened. "Clara, my dear, it has been too long. Is everything all right?" Tears pricked my eyes. Just hearing a kind voice, a voice from my mother's world, was almost too much. I took a deep breath and laid it all out. Richard's job loss, his behavior, his plan to sell the collection. Abe listened patiently, without interruption. When I finished, there was a long silence on the line. "The boy is a fool," he finally said, his voice rumbling with a quiet anger that was more terrifying than any shouting. "He is a greedy, arrogant fool. Your mother saw it in him, you know. She worried." That hit me like a physical blow. She had seen it, and I had been blind. "What do I do, Abe?" I asked, feeling like a lost child. "You do nothing," he said, and I could hear the grim smile in his voice. "You let the fool come to me. You make a show of it. You cry. You beg. You make him believe he is tearing your heart out. And you make sure he brings the entire collection, every last piece." He continued, "I will handle the rest. The documents your mother left with me are all in order. They are ironclad. Just tell me when to expect him." We talked for another few minutes, firming up the details. I hung up the phone, feeling a strange and terrible calm. The trap was set. Now I just had to play my part. And so began the weeks of endurance. I became Ophelia, a woman drowning in her own grief. When Richard brought up the jewelry again that evening, I put on the performance of a lifetime. I wept. I pleaded with him, telling him the pieces were all I had left of my mother. I begged him to find another way. It was like pouring gasoline on a fire. My distress only solidified his resolve, confirming in his mind that he was the strong, rational one, and I was the hysterical, sentimental woman. "For God's sake, Clara, pull yourself together," he snapped, rolling his eyes. "It's jewelry, metal and rocks. Our survival is more important than your little trip down memory lane." Eleanor sat on the sofa, sipping a glass of Chardonnay, a small, satisfied smirk on her face. "She's being theatrical, Richard. Don't let her manipulate you. This is for the best. A clean slate." They began to gloat. They spent hours online looking at luxury resorts and new cars. They were already spending the money. They talked about it in front of me as if I weren't even there. "Once we get a decent price for that junk, we can take a real vacation," Richard said. "Get away from all this negativity." "I saw a lovely little Jaguar," Eleanor mused. "A sophisticated car. Much more fitting for you, dear, than that sensible sedan Clara picked out." Each word was a fresh insult, a new twist of the knife. But I absorbed it all. I let my face crumple. I let the tears fall. I played the part of the broken, defeated wife so convincingly that they stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a pathetic obstacle they had already overcome. This was their fatal flaw. Their arrogance was a blindfold. They underestimated me completely. They saw a doormat, not a coiled snake. I gave Richard the key to the safe deposit box where the main collection was stored. He snatched it from my hand. "Finally," he sneered, "coming to your senses." The day he chose to go to the pawn shop, I feigned a migraine. I locked myself in our bedroom, refusing to come out. Through the door, I could hear him and Eleanor talking in triumphant tones. "She'll get over it," Richard said. "Good riddance to all that clutter," Eleanor replied. "Now, are you sure this pawn shop is the right place? It sounds so grubby." "It's just for an initial appraisal, Mother," he said impatiently. "This guy is supposed to be the best, discreet. We don't want to go to a major auction house and have people asking questions. Once we have a number, we can leverage it." I heard the front door close. I waited 5 minutes, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then I got up. I wiped my face, which was genuinely streaked with tears, tears of rage and anticipation. I put on a simple black dress, pulled my hair back, and slipped out the back door. I took a taxi. I got to Abe's shop 10 minutes before Richard did. Abe greeted me with a solemn nod and led me to the back of the shop, behind a tall partition. "He will not see you," Abe assured me. "Just listen and be ready." He handed me a cup of hot, sweet tea. My hands were shaking like leaves in a storm. This was it, the culmination of weeks of planning, of years of pain. I heard the bell above the shop door jingle. I peered through a tiny gap in the partition. It was him. Richard strode in, carrying the heavy rosewood box as if it were a trophy. He had a smug, self-satisfied look on his face. He placed the box on the counter with a heavy thud. "I'm here to see Abe," he announced, as if he were a king granting an audience. Abe emerged from the back room, wiping his hands on a cloth. He looked Richard up and down, his expression unreadable. "I am Abe," he said. "What can I do for you?" "I have some estate jewelry I'm looking to sell," Richard said, his voice oozing false charm. "Family heirlooms. My wife has finally agreed to part with them. A difficult decision, of course, but necessary." He was already spinning his narrative, painting himself as the responsible husband making a tough choice. My stomach turned. Abe just nodded slowly. "Let's have a look." Richard opened the box. Even from across the room, the contents seemed to glow under the dim lights of the shop. My mother's soul laid out on a velvet counter for this monster to sell. For a moment, a wave of real grief washed over me, so powerful it almost buckled my knees. I leaned against the wall, taking a shaky breath. Richard, meanwhile, was preening. "It's mostly gold and some semi-precious stones, I believe," he said with the air of a man who knew nothing. "Some of it is a bit unconventional, but the materials should be worth a fair bit. I'm looking for a quick, discreet sale. Cash, preferably." Abe didn't answer. He put on a jeweler's loupe and bent over the box. He picked up the first piece, the modernist necklace I had helped design as a child. He turned it over and over in his gnarled fingers. The silence in the shop stretched on. Richard started to fidget. His smug confidence began to fray at the edges. "So," he said, a little too loudly, "what do you think? A few thousand at least. For the gold weight?" Abe ignored him. He picked up another piece, then another. A heavy silver cuff with an uncut tourmaline, a pair of earrings shaped like calla lilies, with pearls for stamens. With each piece, his examination grew more intense. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he put the last piece down and took off his loupe. He looked straight at Richard. His eyes were like chips of granite. "Where did you get these?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Richard was taken aback. "I told you, they were my wife's mother's. They're mine now, ours." "Your wife," Abe said, his voice flat. "Her name is Clara?" Richard's face went white as a ghost. How did you know that?" he stammered. "And her mother was Amelia," Abe continued, his voice like a judge's gavel. "I knew Amelia for 30 years. I knew her work better than anyone." He picked up the necklace again. "You see this mark here?" he said, pointing to a spot near the clasp. "This tiny bird in flight? That was her signature. The mark of one of the most brilliant and enigmatic designers of the last century." Richard just stared, his mouth hanging open. He looked completely lost. "You called this junk," Abe said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You talked about selling it for scrap weight. This single necklace is a one-of-a-kind prototype. It's worth more than your house. The entire collection, we are talking about a sum that would change your life forever." For a split second, a flicker of pure, unadulterated greed lit up Richard's eyes. He saw the money. He thought he had won the lottery. "You're saying it's valuable," he breathed. "How valuable?" And that's when Abe delivered the final, beautiful blow. "It's priceless," he said softly, "and it's not yours." He reached under the counter and pulled out a thick leather-bound folder. He opened it. "This is Amelia's will, of which I am the executor. These pieces are not family heirlooms in the traditional sense. They are a designated artistic collection, placed in a trust for her daughter, Clara. They cannot be sold, transferred, or even appraised for sale without Clara's direct witnessed consent. It's all right here, signed, notarized, and legally unassailable." He slid a document across the counter. "And this," Abe said, his voice dropping even lower, "is a legal declaration you signed when you married her, waiving any claim to her mother's specific inheritance. A standard prenuptial clause you probably didn't even read." The air left Richard's lungs in a whoosh. He staggered back from the counter, one hand flying to his chest. He looked at the jewelry, then at Abe, then at the papers. His brain was short-circuiting, unable to process the new reality that was crashing down upon him. He had not found a treasure. He had walked into a vault and the door had just slammed shut behind him. And that's when I chose to make my entrance. I stepped out from behind the partition. The look on Richard's face was a masterpiece of horror. If he had seen a ghost, he would have been less shocked. "Clara," he whispered, his voice cracking. "What are you doing here?" I didn't answer him. I walked calmly to the counter and stood beside Abe. I looked down at my mother's work, now safe. Then I looked at the man I had spent a decade of my life with. There was no love left, no pity, just a vast, empty space where something used to be. "It's over, Richard," I said, my voice clear and steady. He started to bluster, his panic turning to rage. "What is this? Some kind of setup? You and this old man, you conspired against me. This is my property. We are married." Abe held up a hand. "You brought these items into my shop," he said calmly. "You claimed ownership and you attempted to sell them for cash. That is fraud. Specifically, it is attempted wire fraud and fraud against a trust." Richard just laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "Fraud? Don't be absurd. You can't prove anything." Abe smiled a thin, cold smile. "Oh, but I can." He tapped a small, discreet camera mounted on the wall. "I record every transaction, every conversation. I have you on high-definition video, claiming ownership of stolen property." Richard's face crumbled. The last vestiges of his arrogance dissolved, leaving only raw, pathetic terror. He finally understood. He was trapped, completely and utterly trapped. "Clara, please," he whimpered, turning to me. His face was a mess of sweat and desperation. "Don't do this. We can talk about this. I was under pressure. I didn't know. I'm sorry." The apology was as hollow as he was. He wasn't sorry for what he did. He was only sorry he got caught. I just looked at him. I let the silence hang in the air, let him stew in his own self-made poison. Then I gave him the final judgment. "No, Richard," I said. "We can't talk about this. But you'll have plenty of time to talk to my lawyer, and to them." Abe picked up the phone. He dialed a number. "Yes, Detective Miller," he said into the receiver. "He's here. The man we discussed. Yes, bring the papers." Richard collapsed. He didn't faint. His legs just gave out, and he slid down the front of the counter into a heap on the floor, sobbing like a child. It was the sound of a king being dethroned, the sound of a hollow man finally caving in on himself, and it was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. The aftermath was swift and brutal, just as I had planned. The police arrived within minutes. They helped a blubbering Richard to his feet, read him his rights, and cuffed him. He kept looking at me, his eyes pleading, but I felt nothing. It was like watching a movie about a stranger. He called Eleanor from the police station. I can only imagine that conversation. Her initial excitement about the money, followed by confusion and then screeching, impotent rage when she finally understood what had happened. The legal consequences were catastrophic for them. Richard was charged with multiple counts of fraud. My lawyer, a shark recommended by Abe, filed for divorce immediately, citing financial malfeasance and emotional abuse. The evidence was overwhelming. The video from the pawn shop, my detailed logs of his threats and coercion, the legal documents from my mother's trust. He had no defense. His legal team advised him to plead guilty to lesser charges to avoid a long prison sentence. He ended up with 2 years of probation, a felony record that would prevent him from ever working in finance again, and a court order to pay restitution, which was, of course, impossible for him. The financial ruin was absolute. The divorce court was not kind to him. Given his fraudulent actions, I was awarded the house, its contents, and a significant portion of what little was left in their joint accounts. He was left with his clothes and his debts. Eleanor was forced to move out. The story of the pawn shop prince, as one local blogger gleefully dubbed him, spread like wildfire through their social circle. The shame was total. They were ostracized, their names a punchline at the country club they could no longer afford. Eleanor's friends, who had once flocked to her side to cluck sympathetically about her difficult daughter-in-law, now crossed the street to avoid her. She had to sell her own home to cover her and Richard's legal fees. She ended up in a small, depressing apartment on the wrong side of town. The house, our house, was the last thing to go. I had no desire to live there, haunted by the ghosts of a dead marriage. I sold it, and with the proceeds, plus a carefully managed loan against the now properly appraised value of my mother's collection, I started my new life. I bought the studio space. I built my workshop, better than the one I had dreamed of, and I began to create again. About 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I received a letter. It was from Richard. The postmark was from some dead-end town a few states away, where he had apparently crawled to lick his wounds. His handwriting was shaky, desperate. I stood in my new sunlit kitchen and read the first line. "My dearest Clara, I know I made a mistake." I stopped reading. He didn't make a mistake. A mistake is taking the wrong exit on the highway. What he did was a choice. It was a reflection of his true character, a character I had been too blind to see for 10 long years. He hadn't loved me. He had owned me. And when his other possessions were taken away, he tried to liquidate me, too. I took the letter, and without opening it further, I walked to the new fireplace in my living room. I didn't burn it with anger. I dropped it into the flames with a sense of finality, of peace. It was the last piece of trash from my old life that needed to be taken out. I watched it curl into black ash, and I felt nothing but relief. And that brings me back to today, here in my studio. The afternoon sun is lower in the sky now, casting long shadows across the floor. My mother's locket is warm in my hand. The work I do now is inspired by her, but it is my own. I launched a small, exclusive line of jewelry. It's been more successful than I ever imagined. Museums have inquired about exhibiting some of my mother's collection, and I'm considering it. Her genius deserves to be seen. Her story deserves to be told. The bell on my studio door jingles, a gentle, pleasant sound so different from the jarring bell at Abe's shop. I look up and smile, a real smile this time, full of genuine warmth. It's Daniel. He's an architect I met when I was designing the layout for this space. He is quiet where Richard was loud. He is kind where Richard was cruel. He listens. He sees me, the real me, not the role he wants me to play. He walks over, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need a break," he says, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He looks at the locket on my workbench. "That's your mother's, isn't it?" he asks. "It's beautiful. So much character in it." He doesn't see a price tag. He sees the art. He sees the love. "Yes," I say, my voice thick with an emotion I can finally identify as happiness. "It is." We stand there for a moment, sipping our coffee in comfortable silence, the setting sun painting the room in hues of orange and gold. It's a peaceful life, a life I earned, a life I reclaimed from the ashes of another. My grandmother, a woman who had seen her fair share of hardship, used to say something that I never fully understood until all this happened. She would say, "Never let anyone else tell you what you are worth. The price tag they put on you is always a reflection of their own cheapness." Richard saw a few $1,000s in scrap gold. He saw a quick fix for his own failures. He tried to sell a legacy he couldn't comprehend for a price that was an insult. In the end, he was the one who was worthless. He was the one who was sold for scrap. And me? I learned my own value. And it, like my mother's collection, is not for sale. Not at any price.